biodiversity. And after that, we will move into this segment where our panelists will share some views. And this we decided to divide this in two parts. So the first round will be a bit more like looking at like more on the local level, what people are doing and how international standards like the Peasants' Rights Declaration can come in. And then a second round where we will look more into, international advocacy spaces and how, the declaration can or cannot help us or help, people's struggles to move things there. As I said, if time allows, we'll take some questions. Let's see how well myself and the speakers will respect the time, and then we will have just kind of a closing round at the very end. So that's the plan for today, and I would ask, with not much more ado, I would ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Just quickly who you are and where you're from and what your organization is. So I would invite maybe Tanmay, you can start to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Philip. Hi, I'm Tanmay. I am a farmer from Central India, and I'm part of South Indian Coordination Committee of Farmers Movements, which is part of La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant movement. I do farming here, practicing agroecology. We here grow cotton, which is like indigenous cotton, some millets, sorghum, pearl millet, also some pulses like pigeon pea, green gram, black gram. Along with it, I'm also part of a small collective here, the Gram Art Project, through which we process our cotton into different artworks to express on issues that concern us. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tanmay, and thanks for being with us. Tina, how about you going next?
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for taking the time and for FIAN for having me here. So my name is Mrinalini Rai. I'm from India, but currently I'm based in Thailand. And I coordinate the CBD Women's Caucus, which is a women's constituency. And we've been following the CBD, the Biodiversity Convention negotiations. So this much for me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Let's go to Africa. David, can you briefly introduce yourself, please? Please remember to unmute your mic. David, can you hear us? Okay, let's see if David can connect. Maybe you just Jean, can you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Yes. Hi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Tauli Corpus, but most of you would know me as Jing. I work for an organization called Tebteba in the Philippines. I am the policy advisor, and Tebteba supports indigenous peoples. So we work a lot with indigenous peoples and supporting them in their self-determined development priorities, as well as in crafting supportive policy spaces at both the national and international level. So we also work a lot in the CBD space. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll try again with David. Can you hear us now? Can you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself briefly? David, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Hello, I'm David Otieno from the Kenyan Peasant League, which is a member of La Via Campesina. I'm the General Secretary and also the Policy Advisor of the KPL. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And then let's close with Tammy, who is in Australia, and it's late at night. So please, Tammy, could you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Philip. Yes, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm a small-scale farmer of pastured pigs and cattle and garlic also here in Australia, and the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, who are working, we are a farmer-led organization working mostly around reforming legislation to better enable small-scale farming in a country that is largely industrialized, large-scale farming. That's our key focus. And I've been involved in the CBD and ITPGRFA and all the other acronyms we'll talk about over the course of this evening. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you. I think, yeah, we're looking forward to hear your views, your thoughts on the topic that we are discussing today. Before going into the debate, I think it might be useful if I briefly set the stage by introducing a bit, sharing some thoughts or some elements on this new instrument that we are talking about, namely the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, and specifically also what this instrument says about seeds and biodiversity. Probably many of you know that this declaration is a rather new instrument. It has been adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 2018, but it has a much longer story, and it is the result of a process that lasted for more than 10 years and was initiated by the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, and which was negotiated in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva over several years. As I said, La Via Campesina was a bit at the origin of this process and has been like one of the main driving forces, but in its course also several other social movements and indigenous peoples organizations have participated in this process very, very, very actively. Just to mention indigenous peoples organizations, fisher folk organizations, trade unions, pastoralist organizations. So a lot of rural constituencies have participated in this process. So I think this is perhaps already the first important thing about this declaration, that it comes from a grassroots initiative, and that it has been developed in a process also where rural movements have very actively participated. It is a declaration, so it's a UN declaration, and without going into too much detail about technicalities of international law, a declaration is more of a political character. It's not a binding instrument, which is potentially a weakness of the declaration. However, I think when we talk about, is it binding, is it non-binding, I think it's important always to keep in mind that even if it's a declaration, it's part of the body of international instruments that we have at our disposal to advance people's rights. And so in that sense, maybe it's not even a binding instrument would not automatically lead to kind of more effective protection of communities and people's rights. So I think a part of what we want to discuss today is also like, how can we give the strength to this document in order so that it can actually play its role, be it binding or non-binding. As I said, the declaration was adopted in 2018, and now we are, with that moment, we have moved into the phase of implementation, which in some ways, you know, it's even more complicated than actually the negotiation phase. And as I think many of the social movements and, you know, grassroots organizations know, is that actually like the fight for the implementation is where kind of, you know, it's upon like the people and the movements kind of to give the strength to these instruments that we have at hand. So I think this discussion today is a bit kind of in this context of how do we implement this? How can we use this new instrument in a strategic way? As I said before, I think there are several important aspects that make the declaration, this specific declaration, special. One of the things that I already mentioned is its genesis, so the evolution, where it comes from and how it was developed. That's one thing. I think another element is that in many regards, it somehow challenges, you know, a very, you know, more liberal Western conventional thinking and conception of human rights. You know, and this is probably very much, you know, related also to the fact that, for example, the declaration also speaks about collective rights and doesn't conceive rights only as individual rights, but as has this collective component. And I think specifically also in the context of, you know, the relationship between human societies and nature, also I think there the declaration has interesting things to say and is moving in a direction that probably started with the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, and kind of challenges this kind of separation between, you know, what is human societies on the one hand and what is like the rest of nature on the other hand. I think also a final thing I would like to say is that I think we should never see this declaration in isolation. I think we should always see it in like as yet another instrument that we have at our disposal and that complements other, you know, human rights standards that we have, be it the human rights conventions, but also being other declarations like the rights of indigenous peoples and conventions of environmental law. And I think we will speak a bit about these things. So let's take this declaration what it is. It is not perfect. It's the outcome of a negotiation, but it is there and it has some very important provisions. And I will not go into much detail here. I hope you can see on the screen some extracts from the declaration. The declaration covers a range of issues. So it speaks about a lot of issues that concern rural people. It speaks about food production. It speaks about natural resources. It speaks also about civil and political rights. It speaks about education. So it covers a broad range of issues, but it also has very specific things to say regarding biodiversity and also specifically on seeds. And there are 2 articles that specifically address these issues, and those are Article 19 and Article 20. We will send around some materials also after this webinar so that you can, you know, look into the declaration and maybe find also some additional information to go deeper into this. But I think it's important to know that the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants explicitly kind of reaffirms rural people's rights to their seeds, and these rights have been recognized in other standards before, but here it is specifically in the context of human rights. So the right to seeds framed as a human rights, and the Article 19 further has some important aspects that underline rights components of these rights. So also the rights of peasants and rural people to decide what they actually grow. And the declaration also importantly calls upon states to support the specific management systems that rural people have to manage their seeds. And importantly, it also clarifies that these rights over seeds are not subject to intellectual property rights and other frameworks, but rather on the opposite, that any intellectual property rights need actually to be designed in a way so that they respect peasants' rights over seeds. So that's specifically on seeds. Article 20 of the Declaration speaks broader about biodiversity, and it spells out obligations of states to prevent the depletion of biodiversity, and frames this as an obligation to support the rights of rural people. So which is important in many ways. And a final thing that I would like to highlight is that the declaration also very specifically underlines the importance and the obligation for states to protect the specific, use and management systems of how people, communities use biodiversity and keep developing it through their systems. And it's not only about seeds, but it's also about fisheries. It's also about, pastoralism. It's also about forest biodiversity. So it's a broad framing of biodiversity. And as you can imagine, there would be, a lot of things to say in addition, but I would leave it here, and I would rather like to, invite our panelists to speak a bit about their local struggles. And I would like to start with Tanmay, who is doing great work in India. And maybe you can tell us a bit about that, Tanmay, and then also, reflect a bit on how, this relates to this specific declaration. Please go ahead, Tanmay.
Thank you, Philip. I completely agree what you said, that as Philip just said, it is not a legally binding instrument, but yet it is something which in an international space governments have agreed upon, which means they have responsibility towards the world they have agreed upon. And this is upon grassroots movements like us, how we use this as a pressure technique for advocacy purpose and bring in legislations at national and local levels that are that will help us build our own peasants seed system as well as agroecological systems. Just like I can see many contexts where this can be while going through this declaration, I could clearly see that many of the key issues that we are facing here are somewhat put on paper in this declaration, which we can use. For example, where I'm currently based, we grow indigenous cotton, which is not genetically modified, which is IPR free, and it is not hybrid. That means we save the seeds every year, and we keep selecting it and improving it in our own ways. This seed was almost lost because India is one of the largest cotton producing country in the world, and cotton out of all the cotton that is grown here, more than 95% is genetically modified BT cotton. And especially in the region where I'm based, there are huge monocultures of this crop. Any direction you go, you will just see cotton farms and nothing apart from it. Very rarely anything else. And all this is genetically modified cotton. For me, particularly, and farmers like me, it is difficult because because we don't sell it in the regular market. we grow it, we process it into yarn. The lint, the seed is then distributed or sold to other farmers who need it, and the remaining seed is converted into oil, which we consume at home, and the oil seed cake is kept for our bullocks. This is our whole cycle. If you look at take this one of these important crops that we grow, but the yarn is converted into a yarn artworks, which we then sell to consumers within the country, some local, some in different states, which is the basic. Uh, uh, that is the main cycle which keeps us sustaining economically as well. But because there is GMOs growing everywhere, it is very natural that during some ginning process or during some planting process, some seeds gets mixed. And in my farm, every year in the first 1 month after sowing of seeds, we have to do roguing activity, which is like rooting out all, finding out all the American cottons in my indigenous GM field and rooting them out, which are both look distinct from each other. They are completely different species. This like if I were dependent on some certification agency accreditation for being able to sell my produce to the market as organic, I would have certainly lost the certification, because during field visits, it's obvious that anyone will find out that there is some mixture in crops. But like fortunately, we don't face any such issues, because our consumers don't ask for any certifications from us anyway, which we don't have. But in general scenarios, it's a great risk that affects peasants in a direct economical and biological ways. Yet there is no legal provision in our laws today that deal with the contamination issues. We have guidelines of how GMOs are going to come into the environment released for commercial cultivation, but there is no regulation that will compensate farmers or talk about contamination. Here we have been raising these issues for quite a long time. And now with this declaration, as Philip was mentioning, Article 19 and 20 are pretty much which are very important. And especially in Article 20, Section 3, it especially talks about states' responsibility to prevent risks from living modified organisms. So this is something important, I think, which connects directly to our local issues. And which we can use for to further and strengthen our local legislation here. Another important part is about participation. Many of the seed policies, like if you take any issue, peasants are hardly part of the decision-making process. But like for example, take the issue of seed, like how did we come to such big monocultures from a very diverse set of agricultural systems in the region where I'm based. And almost even those who practice a bit of diversity, the thing is that every year, like people are losing their knowledge of saving their own seeds. Mostly people go to the markets and buy new seeds every year. Actually, if we go back to policy documents, India has a national seed policy which was adopted in 2002, and it is like a policy which clearly mentions that one of the most important goals of national seed policies of India is to increase the seed replacement ratio, which is basically is a measure of how much of the total cropped area was sown with certified seeds in comparison to farm safe seeds. So this all aims towards, they think that it's very important to provide the required food for this country. In order to grow it, farmers need to give up farm safe seeds, and government should work towards replacing it with certified seeds. And it is for this thing, it is also mentioned in the same policy that how private players act in achieving this aim. And and here, like, it is very important. Here, it is very important that people clearly can be seen that farmers' participation in decision making is missing. So in such cases, like it's not just Article 19 and 20 of the UNDROP that we can use, but also Article 10, which talks about participation of farmers in any decision making processes in matters related to our rights. And one of the important rights being seed rights. We have to make, we can use this as a push to further our demand of getting participated in decision-making processes. And the last thing I would like to end with is the access to information part. Because currently the new seed bill in India is being tabled. The draft has come out. So it's not just in order to be able to actively participate in decision-making processes, it is required that access to information is given. Many meetings of different seed processes of what's going on in the national gene banks are this information doesn't come from good, and it's important that this access to information is a right which we all need to highlight in order to be able to protect our seeds, especially from things like biopiracy, which is happening on a large scale from our own gene banks. And for this as well, there are some like Article 11 does talk about of this resolution, draft of this declaration does talk about access to information, which is a very key aspect and a right which we all should have. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanmay, for sharing a bit on the situation in India, your work, and also for reminding us that obviously there are links to other rights that are spelled out in the declaration, but also in other instruments. Maybe Jing, do you want to share a bit on some kind of more the local aspects of the work that you're doing in the Philippines?
Yes, thank you very much, Philip. As I said earlier, I work more on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants is a relatively new instrument for us, and we're familiarizing ourselves with it. But I think that one of the strong points is that it both instruments make some effort to harmonize with each other, and that the more recent instrument reinforces and provides more detail that the UNDROP is lacking. And maybe to cite one, and we face the same problem. Basically, both are declarations, and technically they're not legally binding, but they still do provide some minimum standards. And I think having come later, this Declaration on the Right of Peasants is more expansive in its coverage, and it's informed by the more recent developments in international law. And so Article 20.3 in particular is very important, and I will cite one recent experience we had here in the Philippines. There was a challenge against a genetically modified eggplant lodged by farmers groups here in the Philippines. And, the debate has always been, how do we take into consideration socio-economic considerations? And our law is very clear that before GM LMOs can be planted in indigenous territories, there has to be free, prior, and informed consent. But what the clever planters of GM crops do is that they avoid indigenous territories, but they plant adjacent. And the problem here is that, pollination, these kinds of crops, they don't recognize artificial borders. So I think that this Declaration on the Right of Peasants elevates the standards, and it further provides support for this debate that it closes some of the loopholes, basically. And it says that we have to prevent risks of violations, not just to indigenous peoples, but also to peasants in general, because all of these, they cross-contamination, as Stan Mai said earlier, is a very real possibility, and it happens. And if we use this new instrument, then I think we can better address and close all of the loopholes that our governments are trying to exploit. So I think my main message here is that the rights that have been established for indigenous peoples and this new instrument are mutually supportive, and we should take advantage of all of these mutually supportive provisions to elevate further the protection of rights of both peasants and indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jing, for sharing, also for sharing this very concrete example of what is happening in the Philippines. And with this, I would like to give the opportunity to David to also share a bit on the context in Kenya, and also where you're facing many challenges and doing a lot of work. But maybe you can share some of that. David, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the time. I hope you are hearing me.
Yes,
yes,
we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, maybe just to pick up from what the two colleagues have spoken about, maybe from the Kenyan context, is that the declaration is providing a very big opportunity for the farmers and the indigenous communities to legitimize their way of life, because you find that most of the farmers in the rural areas rely on the small-scale farmers. That is, they rely on the indigenous seeds, exchanging them, storing them, and since it's their way of life, or it's our way of life, then the presence of the declaration, despite the fact that it's not it is not legally binding, it provides an opportunity to perhaps provide or to legitimize the small-scale farmers or the peasants' way of life. And maybe I could also try to state that if you look at the Kenyan Constitution and also the Seeds and Biodiversity Act, you find that the Article 11 of the Constitution of Kenya talks about cultural rights, and it expressly states that it obligates the state to protect and actually preserve indigenous knowledge, indigenous plant varieties, and it basically obligates the states to ensure that legislations are brought forth to protect that particular way of life. But what is worrying us is that despite that express provision in the Constitution, the government has still been pushing some laws that actually are against the peasants' way of life. For example, the government has been talking about food crop regulations 2020, which talks about initially they were talking about prohibiting exchange of seeds, use of plant manure. We also see in the face of the COVID-19, we are seeing a lot of regulations coming out from government that tends to criminalize the peasant way of life, setting high standards that ordinary small-scale farmers cannot meet. You find that local spaces where farmers can exchange the seeds are being actually closed out. And you find that as Kenya Peasant League and allied organizations, what we have been trying to do is to develop petitions to government, basing it on also the declaration, because you find that there's a part of the Kenyan Constitution that talks about any international instrument that the government agrees with becomes part of the Kenyan laws. So we have been using such provisions. We have been sending petitions and sending memorandums to government regarding some of those provisions that we think are actually unconstitutional and illegal. But most importantly, I think in terms of implementing the declaration, it is important that the peasants start living or start implementing the declaration by ensuring that they practice what the provisions, like the one for the seeds. We also have the one for the biodiversity. And also there's also Article 26, which talks about indigenous knowledge, because you find that storing the seeds, selecting the seeds is actually a part of indigenous knowledge that most of it is not documented, but is passed from one generation to another. So you find that it's also very important for us to preserve that knowledge, and maybe as also the Kenya Peasant League, we have actually been documenting such stories. And lately we have been having a program with a PhD student from Italy who was with us last year towards the end. And part of the program was to basically try to get this knowledge, document it, and how, because you find that some farmers don't know how to select the seeds. Some farmers would want to plant the seeds, but they don't know how to go and maybe collect them in the wild. So we have been trying to get that knowledge from the people, especially the older generation who have this knowledge. So maybe in short, what I would say is that it's very important. Sometimes there's this tendency of agitation or maybe going to the streets demanding, but the first step of implementing such an instrument is, yes, we have to agitate, we have to send the memorandums, but we have to practice it. It has to become a guiding principle that actually guides how we operate in our ways. And I think also most importantly, find that in the rural areas, women have been very much instrumental in storing seeds, storing food, selecting selecting the best varieties. So again, if you Article 19 and 20, also the rights of women, their rights to being stakeholders in decision making, especially at the household level, is very critical, because you find that if you go to most of the rural households, you find that it is the woman or the mother or the grandmother who knows where the seeds are, who knows what to plant when, and who knows even the germination period, the germination rate. So I think also this also could also be linked to ensuring that the rights of women are actually respected, because when women are not, or when the rights of women are not respected, or they are not having freedom to take part in the general management of resources, both from the homestead, from the household, and the community, then you find that aspect of knowledge regarding seed storage is lost. And that's why maybe as Kenya Peasant League, we have been, it's part of our regulations that seed banks, and even in terms of storage of food, the women have to take a lead role in that. And maybe finally, you also see that there's also a link to water. And you find that because when you have seeds, when you plant them, you need water. And we have seen situations where water points are being grabbed in Kenya, especially if you go to Migori County, where we have clusters. You find that there are these companies that promote monocropping, sugarcane plantations. We are seeing tea being introduced, the clearing forests, plowing and covering up water points. So it is also very critical for us to ensure that that we reclaim this, and we find that the right to clean water in the declaration is also very critical and linked to seeds, in the sense that we have to reclaim these water points that have been grabbed. We have to protect the rivers. And that's why we have also started a campaign as Kenya Peasant League to ensure that we have case studies on disappearing water points in the counties that we work in. And the intention of this is to basically ensure that we have knowledge of where we had wells, springs, and reclaiming them for the use of communities. And maybe as a wrap up, is during the COVID-19, we have seen a sharp increase of demand for seeds. We are receiving calls from even areas that we don't have clusters, from areas Lodwar in Turkana County, we have in Baringo County, where people are telling us now, we have gone to the agrovet, the seeds are not coming, maybe because of the coronavirus embargo of movement. And that actually indicates the coronavirus has actually exposed the soft underbelly of the globalization, because when the movement is disrupted globally, then it means that when we don't have localized systems of food production and economy, so those areas or those regions that have had networks of farmers who store seeds, those ones who have systems to distribute the foods, have actually been surviving. And that's why, as KPL also, we have linked the rural-based farmers, providing emergency support to vulnerable members or consumers in urban areas. And this food, we're actually sourcing it directly from the farmers in the rural areas. And that actually also brings the aspect of linking to trade. So basically, I think that this crisis has actually exposed the folly of globalization, the folly of industrialized international food systems. And it has actually given the local communities, both in rural areas and the impoverished urban areas, an opportunity to be resilient and to also to practice what they have been doing. So I think the declaration provides us with an opportunity to breathe life to it and ensure that we as the peasant farmers implement those provisions that are there, instead of asking the state to implement them. But we need to practice them, we need to share our seeds, we need to ensure that we get alternative markets for our produce, linking the producers to the consumers directly. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll add something later on.
Thank you so much, David. I think many very important things. That you highlight, in particular also, sharing, this kind of peasant way of living, or the rural peoples and their rights as a part of a very specific way of life, as well, and the aspect also of protecting the knowledge also that is associated to the seeds, and to highlight the role of women. Maybe I think we have spoken mainly about seeds so far, and so I would like to give the word to Tammy, because I would imagine that she will speak more about animals.
Yes, thanks, Philip. So I think it's been interesting hearing the struggles from all of our other comrades here. And in Australia, as most people will probably know, there has not been a peasant class for a long time, but there's a current revival of the peasantry, I suppose. As you know, colonization or invasion destroyed our indigenous agriculture practices, which are also now experiencing a revival. And the new peasant class, so to speak, like myself, are joining them in trying to grow things in agroecological ways and to revive traditional ways of growing food and living. Because we've gone so far down the industrial path, the loss of species in our country is extraordinary, and biodiversity has been declining as rapidly here as anywhere else, if not more so. No more so than in agriculture itself. So we have, for example, we have just 8 breeds of pigs left in this country. We have, I think it's 14 breeds of dairy cattle and many more of beef cattle, but they're being steadily lost to agriculture because of people not growing them, because they're not considered commercially viable in a very industrialized food system. So the new peasants are trying to bring back and save the rare breed livestock, and they're not finding it easy. We live in a country where all of our processing facilities are equipped for uniformity and conforming to particular sizes of animals. We have issues that we're alleged to be causing biosecurity risks with our pastured management practices, which is a totally spurious kind of anti-scientific claim. We know that things like African swine fever and the swine flus and avian flus are not coming from pastured systems. They're coming from intensively raised animals in sheds, or what Rob Wallace calls food for flu. And the current African swine fever crisis in the world, I think, shows us just how unhealthy those systems are. But our governments continue, well, particularly the Australian government, certainly continues to support that kind of monocultures of livestock, just as we do monocultures of seeds. And it's a parallel problem for us in seed in Australia, where very few companies control our seed stock, and very few farmers have access to open pollinated seed and the ability to save and reproduce with their own seed. So we have some mirrored problems, but ours are they've kind of come back after a period of not having had anything except industrial agriculture really as an option in this country. And what interests me about the way the declaration is useful to all of us, whether you're in the global south or the global north, or heavily industrialized or not countries, is that it has provisions to protect us on a number of counts. So I've just made a sort of short list of a few of those exciting opportunities that I use in Australian, whether I'm talking with a local council or a state agriculture department or the federal government. I use my comrades and I on the committee use this instrument all the time now. And one of the things, decision making is a huge one for us. The industrial agriculture industry has all the voice in terms of their... has all the voice in the interactions with the government, or did. The Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance is just coming up on 10 years old, and in the last 5 years we've gained a voice with our government at all levels, and so we constantly remind them of the need for the small-scale farmers' voice to be privileged in discussions around how food should be grown, how people should have access to the food that they would choose to eat, including the importance of agricultural biodiversity as well as ecosystem biodiversity. The control of seeds and breeds, as already expressed by Philip in Articles 19 and 20, is really useful to us. Article 5 talks about our right to sustainable use. You know, we live in a country with a heavy industry for mining, and that kind of extractive industries are constantly degrading our lands and seas, and making it harder for our farmers and fisherfolk to keep those lands viable. And so we have provision there. Article 15 talks about participation in policymaking. 16 about controlling the means of production and agroecology, organic agriculture, and direct sales. So my farm is a community supported agriculture, or CSA farm. And the fact that the declaration has explicitly named the direct sales of food to people as something to be protected as a peasant's right is really important to us. In this country, long supply chains are very well protected, and short supply chains are even sometimes called novel supply chains, because it's novel in this country to sell your food directly to the public. And so giving us Article 16 to say, well, actually, our rights to sell directly should be protected, or are protected. Protection from concentration of land ownership is in Article 17. And I know that most countries around the world are struggling with land grabbing and increased control of large swaths of land by very few corporations. Article 18 talks about the international obligations to combat climate change. And, you know, Australia's not got a great record on fulfilling its responsibilities in the international instruments. And here's another declaration that sort of says we have to follow through on those things. And finally, to David's point, the Article 26 speaks a lot to the protection of traditional knowledge, ways of life, and customs, and that intersects with a number of other instruments, obviously like UNDROP as well. So I think that the declaration is incredibly useful and detailed, of course imperfect in the process of a negotiation, but something that we find in Australia at least helps us with defining that this is a global struggle that we are fighting out locally, and that our government listens to in a different way when we bring both levels of the discussion to the lobbying table.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's for those of us also who participate in, you know, in those international spaces where we negotiate these documents. You know, it's sometimes yeah, the reality seems far away, but I mean, from what I take away from all the interventions so far is that I mean that there is a very clear link and a very clear contribution that those standards, such as this declaration and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and human rights standards in general, can play to support the local struggles, the national struggles. And it's I think it was very useful to listen to your experiences and how you also see that actually there might be entry point to further support this. As I announced, after this first round, kind of more looking at it from, you know, the bottom up, so to say, now kind of moving also into, you know, the more abstract spheres of international negotiations and international governance spaces. And I think we don't, like, there could be, I think there are, the Peasants' Rights Declaration speaks about many things, and obviously the interrelationships and the linkages that can be made. There are many spaces where it can bring in. But maybe before I kind of open up for the second round, maybe just to pick up on two, let's say, key spaces, I think, in this context, and some of them have already been mentioned. I think the first one is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is, let's say, the international, and it's a binding convention. It's a binding standard on biodiversity, which goes back to 1992, but it's still kind of, or increasingly relevant in the face of the rapid loss of biodiversity that many of you have already mentioned. And I think some of you might know that 2020 was supposed to be, or was coined as, the super year of biodiversity, because it was planned, or a new global biodiversity framework was supposed to be negotiated and adopted. And this process is still underway. It's in the current situation, it's a bit on hold, but it's still there. And I think there is an important space there, to also bring in these new perspectives or these developments on how actually the protection of rural people's rights relate to achieving objectives as those set out in the Convention of Biological Diversity, especially the conservation of biodiversity and the sustainable use. And I think while the Convention on Biological Diversity recognizes some rights of local communities and indigenous peoples with regards to biodiversity, I think both the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Peasants' Rights Declaration go much further. And I think in that way, there might be potential to also reinterpret in a way those standards and influence the discussions that are happening there, and which are, some of them are very controversial. I was mentioning the global biodiversity framework, so this kind of new kind of roadmap of how to implement how to actually achieve, halt the loss of biodiversity. But there are also like other very important issues and very contentious issues that are debated at the level of the CBD, and which refer to biotechnologies. As has been said, I mentioned by Jing and by Tan Mai as very also concretely affecting rural communities. And then there is the issue of digitalized genetic information, which is increasingly, let's say, used by the corporate sector in a way to dominate and to privatize biodiversity. So that's the CBD. And I think another space that is very relevant here, and that I think we will speak a bit about in the next half an hour, is the International Seed Treaty, which in a way is closely linked to the CBD, but is much more focused on the issue of seeds, so the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And this treaty remains, we were speaking about binding, non-binding, and the treaty remains the only binding international treaty that protects and recognizes peasants and indigenous peoples' rights to seeds. They're called farmers' rights in the treaty. But the implementation obviously the implementation of those rights at national and regional level has encountered many problems. And here again, like issues such as, digital sequence information, that is, the digitalization, the sequencing of plants, and like they're storing in digital format and then kind of linked to gene editing techniques and so on. So as new ways of actually kind of concentrating the power and the control over the use of biodiversity by corporate actors is a big issue. And at the same time, due to the strong pressure that peasant and indigenous peoples organizations have done, there has been also, governments have been forced in a way to take up the issue on the implementation of the rights, farmers' rights over their seeds. And I think this is the situation where we're at. And many, like to different extents, our panelists, you have been participating in these spaces and processes. And so I would like to hear your thoughts. And I think some of you will probably focus a bit more on the treaty, and others will speak a bit more about the CBD. And I will even give you the freedom to also speak about any other spaces that you might consider as particularly relevant. And I would just maybe start again with Tan Mai. And Tan Mai, please, if you could, time is we're running, like time is advancing. So maybe if you can keep it to 5 minutes, that would be really great.
Sure. Thanks, Philip. So I would more, I've been mostly been involved in the international seed treaty process. And I will be more focused on it and how it is relevant to what we do at our local and national level. Many issues have come up in the past, like especially something which seems to be missing from this declaration on rights of peasants and others working in the rural areas, and it's about consent. National gene banks consider act as if they are the owners of all the genetic resource and all the seeds and planting material that is stored in the gene banks. But it is very important to remind them and also remind ourselves that if they are just the custodians of the seeds which are taken from us from different communities, and they can't just use it or give it away the way they want, or anybody cannot just access it without a proper procedure which is set by involving peasants and peasant organizations in these discussions. Regarding it, there are many examples where we had a meeting a few years back where our seed savers had come together, and as per the Indian plant variety protection laws, if if a if a variety if a peasant variety after a particular period is not registered under this particular act, government or state agriculture universities uh, get the right to register it in their own names. And there are many such provisions in the local laws which are very harmful and which doesn't really leaves a choice for us whether to register or whether to use this proprietary regime or not. But more importantly, talking about the issue of consent while accessing our seeds from the National Gene Bank, this is completely missing. If a researcher or a company has to access any seed from a particular national seed bank, then they sign a material transfer agreement. But it doesn't apply when the seed is actually given or taken away from the local community. At that time, no consent is required and no contract is being signed. I want to highlight two particular examples from international rights research institutes in Philippines. A couple of few years back, they filed a patent, two patents actually, on two varieties of rice. One from one from Indonesia, which is a rice species, daringan, if I'm not wrong, and another is African species of rice. So the Daringan rice has a particular spike gene which which has yield increasing potential, and another there is an African rice which was collected by Indian scientists, and it was actually given to IRI from passed on from the Indian National Gene Bank. So it has a high outcrossing rate, so it can be used. This particular trait can be further used to make more hybrids. And they applied for patents without even asking or consulting the communities from which it was taken in the first place. So such blatant uh, 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 trampling of our rights is happening around the world. So it is very important that we talk about consent, and it is one of the very important part of discussions and negotiations which are happening in international CTT, but clearly missing in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Peasants. And second thing is, like Philip mentioned, the issue of DSI, digital sequence information. It is something which has not even reached public debate. It is not even part of governmental policy level debates in many countries, even if in India. So it's a very sad situation because this is something which is very dangerous that we all need to be aware of. Basically, it is the digital information of genetic sequences of any seed. And if you like, if countries like India, Indonesia, any countries from the south, we should look at rules and regulations that are there in the north to be aware of what's coming next to us. Because right now we think that it's not an issue, but if you see, I would like to take example of Article 9 of European Union's Biotechnological Inventions Directive of 1998. It was it is a law applicable in more than 20 European countries. According to the law, if say I if there is a variety of a particular variety of a particular crop which has a flood tolerant trait, and if me as a particular private firm take a patent on digital information without even accessing the seeds, if I find some I can access these codes online, this digital sequence information online for free. There are many databases across the world, and with all the software and sophisticated and monetary tools that I have, resources that I have, if I can particularly trace that particular genomic sequence, I can there are laws such as these, the one I mentioned right now, which gives me the exclusive rights over that particular trait. and then that trait, that exclusivity right over that particular trait, like this flood tolerant trait, is applicable across all the crops. That means if some company tomorrow, without even having the seed, just based on the information, gets a patent on this flood tolerant trait, and if I'm using maybe a type of bean which has that trait, and it is originally taken from some paddy, then that company can actually make me stop using that particular bean, saying that that trait is owned by me. So such draconian laws already exist in the world, and it's for us people in the south that we need to be aware of these and proactively bring in legislations which safeguards us before this onslaught comes to us. So these efforts are being taken and discussed in the international treaty, but of course this is something which is a very depressing process. Sometimes many right-wing countries, control governments, not agreeing to even discuss it. But we need to bring these discussions at national level as well. Countries, delegates which go to work in these forums need to take a stand, and public awareness needs to be generated. And the last thing I would like to talk about is, of course, the issue of IPRs. Indian law, the all in present agricultural system don't consider seed as a property. It's a natural resources which nobody can own. It's part of our cultural system, but yet we have started to move into a regime where this is considered as a tool to where we can make money out of it. But Indian Patent Act doesn't, in its section 3J, it clearly mentions that seeds and varieties are not patentable. But yet we have a case where Monsanto has patent over our BT cotton for many years, and the patent has been upheld many recent court battles as well. Our plant variety protection law is also applauded in global sphere as one of the most ideal ones, because it allows peasants to use, reuse, sow, exchange farm saved seeds, also including those of the protected varieties. Also those which have a protection exclusivity PVP certificates under this act, those can also be used in the same manner as before this act came into place. So this is something which is very ideal, which all can implement, but this is certainly starting to change, because recently PepsiCo sued some farmers in India for growing potatoes, which was registered in this act. Of course, they had to back out, and the court didn't go to hearings because PepsiCo withdrew. But this has started creating fear among farmers. Soon after that, many farmers started contacting and asking that I'm a potato grower, and can you tell us which variety should I not grow, otherwise I'll be sued. So there's a kind of fear tactics to start playing on people's minds. So this is something which we need to strongly take a stand, that no IPR on seeds is the way to go ahead, whether it be patents or PVPs. But this being a negotiation, we are not we have to be strategic towards how we could take this issue forward. Yeah, that's it for this.
Okay, thank you, Tanmay, for bringing up these kind of these issues and making also the linkages, let's say, between the national work and the policy debate that is going at the national level, and those that are happening in international spaces. In this case, like in the International Seed Treaty, on the issue of DSI, and also related issues related to intellectual property. Maybe you focus a bit more on the international treaty, and I would like to invite Tina now. And I think you know very well the CBD space, and have participated very actively there. And so I would, just like to, would be curious to hear, your thoughts and reflection of, how to, also cross-fertilize or bring together, use the Peasants' Rights Declaration in this CBD space in order to redynamize it and support, the positions of local communities, indigenous peoples, and food producers.
Thank you, Philip. I think this so far has been a very engagement discussions. Let me just share my screen. I have a presentation and hopefully I'll run it through fast. Please let me know if you can see it. Can everybody see my presentation?
I can see it. I think it should be fine, Tina.
Okay. So yes, so thank you very much, Philip, for letting me be part of this presentation. And actually, you really did a very concise briefing already on the CBD. So what I'm taking the opportunity here is on exploring the links with the UNDROP and the CBD, but through a gender perspective. And I think this would also be very relevant for the work that we have been doing, the women constituency, within the work of the CBD for the post-2020. So I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to move my screen here, or I'll put it, okay. So I just wanted to start with the mainstreaming of biodiversity. And I think why I wanted to start the discussion was because the mainstreaming has been recognized within the CBD and its ICHA targets. And also this also came about with when the countries agreed to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by maintaining biodiversity across government and society. And this was during the CBD COP10 and under Goal 1. This was further, I would say, in COP13 in 2016 in Cancun, the parties adopted a decision on mainstreaming of biodiversity. And why I wanted to take this discussion here was it was around that time that there was a very concrete particular focus on agriculture, forestry, fishery, and tourism sectors. And out of that came the Cancun Declaration on mainstreaming the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity for well-being. This has since been expanded with the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration adopted at the last CBD COP, which took place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, during the 14th Conference of the Parties. And in that mainstreaming, it was also added energy infrastructure, manufacturing, and processing sectors. And I still wanted to quickly, in a nutshell, put this here, because I think this would also have a very diverse impact, or maybe, have an impact on the loss of biodiversity in the ongoing discussions relevant to what we are talking right now and beyond 2020. So what I wanted to present today was through a gender context and the work that we, the CBD Women's Caucus, has been doing. So what we really started, what we came together was in same Cancun COP, where a small group of women from different constituencies, the civil society, youth, indigenous peoples, we all kind of came together to really see how we could really maybe take on this work of the Biodiversity Convention through a gender perspective. And also because the convention's preamble itself recognizes that the vital role that women play in the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and affirms the need for the full participation of women at all levels of policy making, implementation for biological diversity conservation. And as David pointed out, the role of women is really very important to be recognized, but the reality is that they are not. And this is also reflective in the analysis that the CBD Secretary, at the first, the IUCN, during Cancun and in Sharm el-Sheikh, the CBD Secretariat, when they undertook the review of the NBSAP reporting that the governments submit, they still saw a lack of governments, the NBSAP reporting on how women were contributing to biodiversity conservations. And this has been a discussion since then that we really need to amplify the voices of women to be able to be in these reports, and also have programs and beyond capacity building, but also have their rights recognized for the implementation of the biodiversity. So I'll quickly run through this slide. I'm sorry, I'm keeping a track on my time. So what really focused us all is on the gender plan of action of the CBD, and which was adopted at the COP12 in 2014. And the plan is from 2015 to 2020, and 2020 being this year. And also I put that in the highlights saying that this needs update, because this is one of the engagement, advocacy engagement that we are looking at, is engaging in this, is as a discussion for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is taking place. After that, one of the things that would need to be updated is the gender plan of action to also complement the work of the CBD. And I just quickly put in some of the strategic objectives of the gender plan of action, and also considering that one more thing to point out is from the gender perspective, the CBD is the first of the Rio Conventions to have actually adopted the gender plan of action. But I shouldn't say unfortunately, but one of the challenges has been that the gender plan of action does really lack actionable points, actionable what the countries needs to do, the parties needs to do. So it's really very a basic framework. So what we are really looking at is that when this further gets into discussion, that we would actually basically have a post-2020 gender plan of action with a bit more of content and context towards the implementation of the new GBF. You could check out the more details of the plan at the link that I have shared. Now, so Philip, when you talked about how do we really see this work? And so what I really try to do here is I try to look at the UNDROP and looking at the Biodiversity Convention. And with all the rich discussion that we have been having for about an hour now, I really see that I personally see a lot of potential work that the UNDROP could definitely get into the post-2020 discussion. I might not have time to go through all that. I made some points here, but just a quick brief analysis from my part has been that, like Tanmay, you talked about the plant treaty and the biodiversity convention, and as Philip, you pointed out, they're very similar. They started off very similar. You know, the pillars, so we call the CBD, and the international plant treaty is the same. They are based on these three pillars: conservation, sustainable use, and the fair and equitable benefit sharing from genetic resources. Now, placing the UNDROP within that, a lot of the points that I will say might be a repetition of the speakers who have talked before me. So what I really looked at was that the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity, agrobiodiversity, agroecology. And like Jing mentioned, I think I think one of the advantage of having the UNDROP has been that it could be complementary to the UNDROP, because it also talks about a healthy environment, right? To a clean, safe, and healthy environment to use and manage. And this is very ambitious. And this is something that has also been building up in the spaces for the CBD, including a core group of organizations taking the lead on, with also the support of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environments, Mr. David Boyd, on looking at this, on looking at human rights and healthy ecosystems. And within the CBD, some of the organizations have also, for the post-2020, had organized a expert workshop on human rights recently in February, right before the Open-Ended Working Group, actually here in Chiang Mai, where I'm based. So elements of human well-being in direct relation to use, conserve, and impacts, and food sovereignty, health, livelihood, social relationships, cultural and spiritual values, aesthetic values. And these, I mean, you all are more familiar with the UNDROP than I am, but I really saw these interlinkages. We're talking about Article 18 talks about conservation. You have 19 on rights to seed. I won't go much more on it. Tammy and Phil, we really explained a lot on this. Then you have Article 20 on rights to biological diversity that also talks about conservation and sustainable use, and also traditional knowledge. And then you have Article 26, some cultural rights and traditional knowledge. And then you have, again, a very important aspect that a lot of the people have also been working towards. The CBD has a right to land, right to indigenous peoples, lands and territories, ICCAs. This work has been ongoing a lot under the area-based conservation, the strategic plan that is coming to the end under Target 11 on protected areas and OECMs. I'm so sorry, there are a lot of acronyms, like Tammy said. Other effective area-based measures, which finally has a definition only 2 years ago at the last COP14. So links of possible discussion has been, like, what I could notice was right to a healthy environment. This links up a lot with the harmonization with the CBD's 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, the rights-based approach to conservation, management, and sustainable use. And of course, one of, again, the key aspect has been the traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices, access and benefit sharing, and recognition of the roles of indigenous, roles of also women and youth. And in this regard, UNDROP also has that on Article 4 of no discrimination against women, including their access to natural resources and their right to land. And again, I think same like the SDGs or the is that this article, and how David pointed out, it should or is very relevant to all the other articles of the UNDROP. So just quickly looking at the CBD and the work, and I think we also have, great to have Jing here, who has more experience with that, working with the IFB, the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity. But just a quick sharing of that under the CBD, there are a lot of good work that the working group on 8J has taken up on. And there are a lot of guidelines, the EquiCon guideline, the, I cannot spell that word, but the code of conduct to respect cultural and intellectual heritage of indigenous peoples and local communities. And you can find many of the guidelines at the link above. And then you have a very important development that took place within the CBD, that they have 2 supplementary protocols. One of them is on the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization. I think one of the things I really want to point out, where I see a lot of discussion from the speakers before me talking about, Tame talked about consent, and under the Nagoya Protocol, they have, on the access, and talking about access, there is a provision there that talks about, at the domestic level, the establishment of clear rules and processes for recognizing prior informed consent. Under the CBD, we don't have FA, but we do have PIC, prior informed consent. So these are some of the good outputs of the working group on 8J. And I have some more information on the genetic and the DSI, but I'll kind of quickly go through this first. So with the perspective of gender, so we decided that, you're talking about the UNDROP, you're talking about the SDGs, you're talking about the post-2020 biodiversity itself. And one of the key things that also brings us together, which has been really very weak, also has been the recognition of roles of indigenous women, including their traditional knowledge to conserve, to sustainably use, and to also have access and benefit sharing to those genetic resources. So then we, a group of us, are been following this for the CBD, as I mentioned, and also adhering that under the COP14 for the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It was supposed to be gender responsive. And as part of that, the Secretariat and UN Women organized an expert meeting last year, which some of our members had participated and contributed. And just with the recent update as that we were in Rome to attend the second open-ended working group in February. And besides actively engaging and proposing and recommending some changes in the new targets and goals, we were also able to propose a new target on gender. This is very ambitious. It is in the outcome document. We'll see how it goes from there. But one of the critical issue out there was to kind of highlight and uplift the women's representation and leadership in decision-making, access to biological resources, including land, and equitable benefit sharing, and opportunity to integrate gender as a cross-cutting component for Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. This was also, we have been trying to also work towards building a link between some of the synergies with the MEAs. So we've been kind of engaged in that work also, but that will not take place if the Biodiversity Convention itself lacks recognizing and actually putting in place some of these aspirations for a transformational shift that it keeps talking about. So as you mentioned, a lot of the meetings before the COVID pandemic really has also impacted a lot of the international meetings. So some of the key meetings that we hope to contribute to is the SBSTA, the technical body of the 24th session, and the SBI's subsidiary body implementation, under which this tentatively is for August to be in Montreal, but might get postponed. And in the SBSTA meeting, they would be discussing indicators. So we are hoping that we will be able to propose some gender responsive indicators there. At the SBI 3, there will be a review of implementation of the gender plan of action itself. So there was a survey, there's going to be a report prepared by the Secretariat. We contributed to the survey, so we hope to also see what the combined report is all about and how to put some key recommendations from there into the document of SBSTA. And also on the LMO that somebody was mentioning about, I'm really sorry. I think so far the discussion has been so interesting with local experiences, and I'm putting a little bit of technical words here, so my apologies. But one of the key items for the SBSTA 24 is going to be on risk assessment and on LMO of species and engineered gene drives of fish. So if you have people, Fisher Forks might be interesting to look at it. Then you have the open-ended working group 3. The dates are again postponed. Then you have the working group on 8J. Again, a very good, could be a contribution of looking at how to also engage, because even the work of the working group on 8J would be discussed, because the strategic plan is ending 2020. So all the processes like the gender plan of action, so will the work of working group 8J will be forming. There's already been some discussion around it, it will be an ad hoc. So there's a lot of discussion, and maybe you could ask Jing also about it. And of course, then you have the CBD COP15, supposed to be sometime next year. Last slide.
Okay, yeah, so thanks. Tina, if you could wrap up.
So this is it. So this is what we were talking about, what the CBD women has been focusing on to make the post-2020 gender responsive. I'm just going to skip this, and I think this is just about us, and that's it. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to be here to ask any questions, or please reach out. I'll stop here. Thank you. Sorry, I rushed too fast.
Sorry for interrupting you, Tina, and thanks very much. I mean, it's important also to share a bit some of this of the process that is going on in the CBD, and like you said, the idea is kind of to bridge those, like more environmental spaces and human rights spaces, if you want to call them like that. So I think it's fair enough to look at them from both sides, and I think you very well you put it. You shared some very interesting insights from let's say what is going on in the CBD, around the CBD currently, and And I also, would like to emphasize what you said, these linkages to the right to land that are in the UNDROP, and that is kind of very important also in the discussion and that is going on in the CBD. We are kind of, in a way, out of time, but I would still like to give the other panelists possibility to still also contribute to this round. I would therefore suggest that we go for another 10 minutes if that's possible for everyone. I see some people had to leave. That's unfortunate. We're a bit but I think the discussion was rich. I was not wanting to cut anybody off. Unfortunately, it looks like we have lost David, who has issues with his connection. I know I'm trying to help him to connect back, but maybe we just go on. And I would just invite, maybe we stay with the CBD and kind of looking at that and looking from there to the Peasants' Rights Declaration, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Declaration. And I think that Jing, you already mentioned some of those issues in your first intervention, but maybe you can develop a bit more on that. That would be really, really great.
Okay. Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you also Tina for providing some context on the CBD. One of the things that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is trying to do is to be really strongly evidence-based. And one of the key findings coming out of the global assessments is that overexploitation is one of the key drivers, direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So what I would like to do now is to focus on a couple of action targets in the Zero draft, which were negotiated in Rome. And the first one is Action Target 8, which is about conserving and enhancing the sustainable use of biodiversity in agriculture and other managed ecosystems. Now, this is one attempt of the co-chairs of the post-2020 working group to embed mainstreaming in the framework. However, when we looked at this proposed action target, it didn't make sense because it talked about it was focusing on closing the productivity gaps. And, when you focus unduly on closing productivity gaps, it sort of runs counter to this goal of enhancing sustainable use and conservation. So I was very fortunate in Rome to be part of the Philippine delegation. And one of the things that we proposed was to, instead of focusing on reducing productivity gaps, we focus on supporting agroecology and indigenous food systems and increasing the area devoted to these types of small-scale agricultural practices, because this is what would lead us towards conservation and enhancement of sustainable use in agriculture, and it would more effectively lead towards mainstreaming and addressing the driver of overexploitation. So that was one target, and we're hoping that it's going to be an uphill struggle to keep that in the text. But looking at the UNDROP, I think there's sufficient support in that document to bolster the arguments for refocusing Action Target 8. And Action Target 11, which is on benefit sharing, again, focuses unduly on increasing sharing of benefits. And what we wanted to do as the Philippines was to ensure synergies with other global instruments and to extend the coverage not just to genetic resources, but also to biological resources. And I think this is quite aligned with the UNDROP because this is one such instrument that the CBD should synergize with, and also biological resources, which would include seeds, as well as being mindful of the risks related to the risk of violations related to LMOs. So I'll stop there, recognizing that we don't have enough time, but just saying that I hope we can cooperate with each other to make sure that those elements stay in the text. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jing. That was also really good, and I think I appreciate also the that we start thinking kind of not just kind of in abstract terms like how to link them, but on the very concrete things, and now on the very concrete entry points that we have, like as you said, in very specific targets that are under negotiation just now under this global biodiversity framework, which will kind of orient, guide state action over the last 10 years and beyond. And I think I think that those are the linkages that we're trying to do. And I think that, as you said, like this kind of, I think it's already kind of a shift of, kind of on how agriculture is addressed in the context of the CBD. Like, I think historically it's fair to say that agriculture was more seen as a problem for biodiversity, and that's justified for a certain type of agriculture. But I think we're now kind of at a point where we can discuss about, or where discussions are about, how farming communities, indigenous communities, small-scale food-producing communities actually, through their practices, actually contribute to protecting biodiversity, to further developing agricultural biodiversity, but also ensure healthy ecosystems. And then I would, I would just perhaps give the word just without further ado to Tammy. And since time is a bit, we're almost out of time, I would just suggest that Tammy, you take it up and you wrap everything up, and because you also want to go to bed because it's really late in Australia.
It's almost midnight here now, so I would love to wrap it up. That would be great. Thanks, Philip. I actually just would like to offer the insight as one of the IPC members who is newer to the CBD process and has a longer experience of the UNDROP and the seed treaty. That I think what's really interesting for me is that the peasant's voice has not been very explicitly present in the CBD processes until more recently, even though Indigenous peoples and local communities' voices have been there for a long time. And in some ways that has brought the peasant's voice in, but not, as you just referenced, agriculture has been seen kind of as the enemy of biodiversity because there weren't the kind of voice that the IPC and La Via Campesina bring to these meetings to talk about the role of peasants and management of biodiversity in agroecological systems. We didn't have quite the level of voice. And so for me, the UNDROP having been ratified just over a year and a half ago, and now to be in this process for the global biodiversity framework, and able to use that instrument in that space at the same time as establishing the peasant's voice as distinct and part of this need for the radical transformation of the food system from the peasants themselves and Indigenous peoples and fisher folk, I think is it's an exciting time, and in a way the pandemic, as awful as it has been for the majority of the world, also they talk about disaster capitalism. There's also perhaps disaster socialism. There's an opportunity here that we can't miss. The pandemic has direct links to industrialized society and food systems, and we shouldn't let that information go to waste, and use it to our benefit, and point out the role of peasants in protecting biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. So I just wanted to finish on a hopeful note, as I usually do. I think that there's a good opportunity with the instrument that's been ratified, the fact that the CBD has this process in place, and we've just had a pandemic caused by all the things that we've been fighting against for so long. So I'm hopeful as always.
Okay, thank you so much, Tammy. And I think this is, for this rather positive note. And I think overall, I would say, yeah, we have spoken a lot about the challenges, but for me, yeah, you know, the takeaway is that, anyway, you know, kind of all the work that is being done on the ground, the work that is being done in those, you know, kind of crazy, abstract international governance spaces. I mean, there's a lot of work, and actually this work, you know, is already happening. And I think just kind of also making these connections and working together will hopefully, yeah, allow us to kind of to amplify the voices of food producers, organizations, of indigenous peoples, of local communities. Time is up. We're over time. I would like to apologize to all participants. We have not been able to, you know, take up the questions. I saw that there has been some discussion. There have been some questions raised in the chat. Some of the panelists have already kind of responded to that. I think we will see internally, we'll see to what extent we can also maybe take up some of the remaining questions, and or at least, you know, share also useful resources once we send out the link for the of the recording, so that you kind of, you have also, you know, some, if in case your question has not been directly addressed, so that at least maybe you can find some resources where you can find that. And I think also that you know, some of the questions, you know, have also been very specific on issues like benefit sharing that we have touched marginally, and other questions also a bit more contentious, perhaps, on potential positive views of GMOs and these kind of things. So I think there is a lot of discussion still to be done. I think we, many of us, or some of us, will have possibilities and ways to further discuss these issues. I would like to thank all the panelists for their time, for their contributions. I think it has been a very rich conversation. It has been great to hear your opinions from your work that you are doing. And yeah, thanks to all for your time. As said, you will, in the next days, you will receive the link to the recording, and with some additional resources, also the presentations that have been made. And then you can also share this with other people and use it also as a, you know, as a starting point for an ongoing conversation. So with that, I would like to close. Thanks to everyone. Good night. Good afternoon. Have a nice evening, or have a nice start into the day. And thanks to everybody.
All right, thank you.